Tonight, 5 quiet chapters from the Odyssey, Season 1, Part 1. We begin with the wine-dark sea. The ship moved through the darkness like a dream, steady and sure, carrying its sleeping traveler across the wine-dark sea. Inside the curved hull, wrapped in warm blankets given by kind strangers, Odysseus slept more deeply than he had in 20 years. The Phaeacian sailors rowed in perfect rhythm, their oars dipping silently into the calm waters, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead like a blessing written across the heavens. All through the long night they traveled, while the sleeper drifted through peaceful dreams. He dreamed of olive groves heavy with fruit, of hillsides covered in wild thyme, of a stone house where firelight flickered against familiar walls. He dreamed of home, unaware how close that home had come. As the first pale light of dawn began to ease across the eastern sky, the ship approached a sheltered harbor on the island of Ithaca. The sailors knew this place, though he did not wake to see it. They knew the ancient olive tree that stood at the harbor's edge, its gnarled trunk a landmark for generations of travelers. They knew the welcoming curve of the bay, protected from winds by rocky arms that reached into the sea like an embrace. With infinite care, the Phaeacian sailors lifted him from the ship, still wrapped in his blankets, still deep in peaceful slumber. They carried him to the warm sand beneath the olive tree, laying him down as a mother lays a sleeping child in its cradle. Around him, they placed the gifts their king had given: bronze tripods catching the early light, golden cups that held the first rays of sunrise, and fine woven cloth folded with care. Then, without waking him, without asking for thanks or farewell, the sailors returned to their ship. Their oars touched the water once more, and they slipped away into the morning mist, leaving the wanderer alone on the shore of his own island, surrounded by treasures gleaming in the early light, sleeping peacefully on the sand of a home waiting to be remembered. The sun rose higher, warming the beach with amber light. Seabirds called overhead, and small waves whispered against the shore in an endless, lulling rhythm. He stirred in his blankets, awareness returning slowly like a tide coming in. He felt the warmth of sunlight on his face, heard the familiar sound of the sea, smelled the sweet fragrance of wild herbs carried on the breeze. Slowly, peacefully, he opened his eyes. For a long moment, he simply lay there, watching the morning light filter through the silvery leaves of the olive tree above him. He did not know where he was. The Phaeacians, he remembered. The kind king and queen, the young princess who had found him on the beach. The great hall filled with song and story. They had promised to take him home. But this place... He sat up slowly, looking around at the still harbor, the rocky hills rising beyond, the mist that still clung to the inland valleys. Something stirred in his heart, a feeling he could not quite name. The shape of the hills seemed familiar, like the face of someone he had once known well, but could not quite place. The scent of the air, thyme and olive and the salt of the sea, tugged at memories buried deep beneath 20 years of wandering. But Athena, goddess of wisdom, had wrapped the island in an enchanted mist, blurring its edges, changing its familiar landmarks just enough that he could not be certain. She did this not from cruelty, but from love, knowing that his homecoming must unfold slowly, like a flower opening to the sun. He rose to his feet, brushing sand from his clothes, and walked slowly along the shore. He sat down on a weathered rock at the water's edge, gazing out at the sea. The morning was beautiful, the water calm, the sky pale with early light, the breeze mild and warm. He breathed it in, waiting, as he had learned to wait. It was then that a young shepherd appeared, walking along the beach with the easy grace of one who knew every stone and path. But this was no ordinary shepherd. Athena had taken this humble form to approach her beloved hero, to guide him through the final steps of his long journey home. She greeted him kindly, and something in her voice, though he did not yet recognize her, brought comfort to his weary heart. When he asked where he was, what land the sea had brought him to, she smiled with a warmth that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the ages. The breeze stilled, the waves grew hushed against the shore, even the seabirds fell silent, and the shore grew quiet. "This is Ithaca," she told him. "This is your home." And as she spoke the name, the mist began to lift from his eyes. Not the mist that hung in the valleys, that remained hazy and dreamlike, but the mist of confusion that had clouded his recognition. Ithaca. The word rang through him like a bell, like a song remembered from childhood. Like the first breath of spring after a long winter, he looked again at the hills rising before him. And now he knew them. That peak where he had climbed as a boy to watch the ships come in. That grove where he had walked with his father, learning the names of every tree. That harbor where he had set sail 20 years ago, young and confident, not knowing how long the journey home would be. Tears came then, slow tears of joy and relief and a gratitude so deep it had no words. He knelt and touched the sand, pressing his palms against the earth of his homeland, feeling its warmth, its solidity, its patient waiting. For 20 years this island had been here, holding his place, keeping his home, waiting for his return. The moment stretched and settled, like dust motes finding their rest in a beam of light. The sea resumed its eternal whisper. The breeze stirred again through the olive leaves above. Now Athena revealed herself fully, no longer the young shepherd, but the goddess in all her calm radiance. She sat beside him on the shore, and her presence was like a calm fire, warming but never burning, illuminating but never harsh. She spoke to him gently, with the steady assurance of one who understands that all things unfold in their own time. His home, she told him, was not as he had left it. The great hall had grown noisy with guests who had overstayed their welcome, and the household had fallen into uneasy rhythms. But Penelope, his beloved wife, kept the house with wisdom and patience, waiting always, hoping always, refusing to believe that her husband would not return. But her words brought only calm to his heart. He had faced greater dangers, weathered greater storms. What mattered now was that he was home. The rest would unfold as it must, in its own time, with its own rhythms. Together, goddess and hero walked to a nearby cave, ancient and sacred, where clear water dripped from the stones and the air was cool and still. Here they hid the treasures the Phaeacians had given him, safe from any who might take them. And here, the goddess worked her subtle magic, transforming him into the form of an old wanderer, his skin weathered, his back bent, his clothes simple and worn. This disguise, she explained, would let him move quietly through his own land, finding those who were still faithful and those who were not. He must be patient a little longer, move carefully. Let the situation reveal itself before he acted. And he, who had learned patience through 20 years of wandering, who had grown wise through suffering and tender through loss, accepted this gentle task with a steady heart. He was home. That was enough for now. Everything else would follow, like waves following the moon, like seasons following the sun. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the still harbor, Athena pointed the way to the hut of Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd who had served the household of Odysseus since both were young. There, she promised, he would find shelter, food, and faithful company. There he could rest while the next chapter of his story prepared itself to unfold. And so he set off along the winding path that led inland, away from the sea that had carried him so far. His steps were slow now, matching his disguise, but his heart was light. Above him, the olive trees whispered their welcome in the evening breeze. Beneath him, the rocky soil of Ithaca supported each footfall. Around him, the familiar scents and sounds of home wrapped him like a blanket, like a blessing, like a promise kept at last. The sun moved slowly toward the western hills, painting the sky in fading shades of gold and rose. Somewhere ahead, a thin trail of smoke rose from a humble dwelling, carrying the scent of wood fire and simple cooking. Somewhere ahead, a faithful servant went about his evening tasks, not knowing that his master was approaching, not knowing that 20 years of waiting were about to reach their peaceful end. And he walked on, unhurried now, savoring each step on the soil of home. The journey had been long, so very long. But he was here at last. He was home, and in that knowing, there was a peace deeper than sleep, a rest more complete than any bed could offer, a homecoming that had only just begun to unfold its hidden gifts. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, and the first crickets began their evening song. He smiled beneath his wanderer's disguise and walked on toward shelter, toward firelight. The olive leaves rustled overhead. The path wound gently through the hills. The scent of thyme rose from the warming earth, and somewhere ahead, a hearth fire waited. Step by step, breath by breath, the wanderer made his way home, wrapped in the stillness of the falling night. Far from the shores of Ithaca, beyond the paths of ordinary sailing, there lay an island that few mortals had ever seen. It rose from the sea like a green dream, its cliffs softened by cascading vines, its forests thick with ancient trees. The air was sweet with the scent of cedar and cypress, and streams of clear water sang their way down from hidden springs to pools where lotus flowers bloomed in perpetual peace. This was Ogygia, the island of Calypso, and here Odysseus had dwelt for 7 long years. The goddess had found him washed up on her shore, the sole survivor of a shipwreck that had claimed all his companions. She had nursed him back to health, had given him food and shelter and clothing, had offered him everything her divine power could provide. And she had fallen in love with him. This mortal man with the clever eyes and the steadfast heart. This wanderer who had seen more of the world than most men could dream of. She offered him immortality. She offered him eternal youth. She offered him a place beside her forever, free from the sorrows and limitations of mortal life. But Odysseus refused, gently, repeatedly, with all the courtesy he possessed. His heart belonged to another. His home called to him across the waters. No gift, however precious, could replace what he had lost. And so he stayed. Not as a willing guest, but as a gentle prisoner, bound by forces he could not overcome. Each day he rose and walked to the cliffs that overlooked the sea, and there he sat from morning until evening, watching the horizon, longing for a sail that never appeared. The morning mist lay soft on the water as he made his way along the familiar path. His feet knew every stone, every root, every turning, for he had walked this way countless times. The birds sang in the branches overhead, and the flowers nodded in the breeze. But he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the sea. Always the sea. The endless expanse that separated him from everything he loved. He found his usual spot, a flat rock worn smooth by his daily presence, and settled onto it with the weariness of long sorrow. The sun was rising, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold, and the sea glittered like hammered bronze beneath the light. It was beautiful, achingly beautiful. But beauty had lost its power to move him. He had seen too much of it, felt too much of its hollow comfort. His thoughts, as always, turned to home. To Penelope, sitting at her loom, waiting with the patience that had made him love her from the first. To Telemachus, the infant son he had kissed goodbye, now grown to manhood without a father's guidance. To the halls of his ancestors, the olive groves of his youth, the people who had trusted him to lead them and protect them. 7 years. 7 years since the storm had taken his ship and his men and cast him onto this shore. 7 years of kindness that felt like captivity, of comfort that tasted like ash. He was grateful to Calypso, he truly was. She had saved his life, had treated him with more generosity than he deserved. But gratitude was not love, and this island, however beautiful, was not home. The morning passed slowly, as mornings always did. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shortened, the sea remained empty. He sat and watched and remembered, his mind wandering through the years, revisiting the choices that had led him here. He thought of Troy, of the war that had consumed a decade of his life. He thought of the victory that had seemed so sweet, the treasures they had won, the glory they had earned. He had been so eager to sail home, so certain that the worst was behind him. He had not known, could not have known, what the gods still had in store. He thought of the islands he had visited, the dangers he had faced, the companions he had lost. Each memory was a wound, healed over but never forgotten. The giant with the single eye, the witch who turned men into beasts, the spirits of the dead called up from the shadows to speak their hollow truths. He had survived them all, had endured and planned and struggled his way through every trial. And yet here he sat, held by kindness, bound by love. The afternoon sun grew warm on his back. He shifted on his rock, stretching muscles grown stiff from sitting. The sea stretched out before him, unchanged, unyielding, offering no answers to the questions he did not bother to ask anymore. When evening came, he rose and made his way back to Calypso's cave. It was a beautiful dwelling, hung with vines and filled with the scent of burning cedar wood. The goddess greeted him with a smile, as she always did, and offered him food and wine, as she always did. They ate together in companionable silence, two souls sharing a space, but not a life. Calypso watched him with eyes that held both love and sorrow. She knew his heart was elsewhere. She had always known, but she could not let him go. The love she felt was too strong, too deep, too selfish to release its grip. She told herself that he would learn to be happy here, that time would soften his longing, that eventually he would accept what she offered. But each day his eyes turned to the sea, and each day she saw the hope that never quite died. The night settled over the island, wrapping it in darkness and the sound of crickets. The wanderer lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling of the cave, watching the shadows cast by the dying fire. Sleep came slowly these days, and when it came, it brought dreams of home that left him more bereft upon waking. He thought of Penelope, wondered if she still waited, wondered if she had been forced to choose another husband. The thought was a knife in his heart, but he could not help returning to it, probing the wound to see if it still hurt. It did. It always did. He thought of Telemachus, tried to imagine what the boy looked like now. A man grown. He wondered whether the boy remembered his father at all. He hoped the boy knew that across the sea, someone thought of him every single day, loving him with a love that distance could not diminish. The fire settled into embers, glowing soft and warm in the darkness. Outside, the night birds sang their haunting songs, and the sea whispered against the shore with its eternal rhythm. He closed his eyes and let the sounds wash over him, let them carry him toward the sleep that would bring both comfort and sorrow. In his dreams, he walked the halls of his own palace, touched the walls he had known since childhood, embraced the wife who had waited for him through everything. In his dreams, he was home, and the years of wandering were just a fading memory. He held on to these dreams as long as he could, knowing that morning would take them away, knowing that he would wake once again in paradise and feel it as a prison. But even in his sorrow, there was a stubborn thread of hope that refused to break. The gods were not without mercy. What was bound could be unbound. What was held could be released. Somewhere, somehow, there would be a way home. He believed this because he had to, because the alternative was a sorrow too deep to contemplate. The night deepened around him, peaceful and soft. The island of Calypso held him in its gentle grip, beautiful and lonely. And he slept, dreaming of Ithaca, dreaming of love, dreaming of the homecoming that waited for him beyond the wine-dark sea. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient witnesses to countless mortal sorrows. The waves kept their patient rhythm. And in the cave at the heart of the island, a wanderer rested, his heart reaching across the miles, holding fast to what he could not see, trusting in what he could not prove. Morning would come, as it always did, and with it the long walk to the cliffs, the long watch over the empty sea. But perhaps tomorrow would be different. Perhaps tomorrow would bring the change he had waited 7 years to see. Hope was all he had left, and hope, however fragile, was enough to carry him through another night. The embers faded. The darkness grew complete, and he slept on, held by the island, held by the goddess, held most of all by the dream of home that nothing could take from him. The stranger on the shore. There was once an island at the edge of the world where time moved like honey from a tilted jar. The days there had no sharp edges. The light came soft through cedar boughs, and the sea around it lay still in shades of wine-dark calm. On that island, a man had lived for 7 years. His name was Odysseus. He had come there as a castaway, worn thin by salt and sorrow, and a goddess named Calypso had kept him in her care. She loved him in her way. She offered him immortality, a life without ending, days that would never grow short. But the wanderer could not accept what she offered. His heart pulled westward, always westward, toward a rocky island he called home. And so, at last, the gods intervened. Word came down from Olympus that the goddess must release him. She did not do so gladly, but she did so with grace. She showed him where the tallest trees stood on the island. She gave him tools of bronze. She brought him bread and wine and sat with him as he worked. He felled the timber. He shaped the logs with care. He built a raft broad enough to carry a man across open water. It took him 4 days. The wood smelled of cedar, and the chips curled pale against the dark earth. Each joint he fitted with the patience of a man who understood that craft was its own kind of prayer. On the 5th morning, the goddess dressed him in fresh linen. She filled skins with water and dark wine. She packed dried figs and barley bread wrapped in cloth. The raft sat ready at the shoreline, its sail catching the first breath of wind. He set out at dawn with the stars still fading overhead. For 17 days, he sailed. The sea was calm beneath him, and the nights were vast with starlight. He steered by the constellations as Calypso had told him. The bear turned slowly in the north. The Pleiades rose and set. He did not sleep much, but when he did, his dreams were of olive groves and time growing wild between stones. The salt air settled on his skin and in his beard. His hands grew rough against the steering oar. But the sky remained clear, and each dawn brought the same steady wind behind him. He ate sparingly. He drank the wine mixed with water. He watched the horizon as one watches for a candle in a far window. On the 18th day, the sea changed. The water darkened beneath the raft. The wind shifted. Clouds gathered in a low gray line. The god of the sea had noticed him at last. What followed need not trouble the listener. There was wind, and there was water. The waves rose high, and the raft came apart, log by log, and the man was left in the open sea with nothing but his hands and his endurance. The details of the storm belong to another kind of story. What matters here is what came after. A goddess who lived in the deep water took pity on him. Her name was Leucothea. She had once been mortal herself, and she remembered what it was to be fragile. She surfaced beside him in the churning gray and offered him her veil. It was a shimmering thing, light as sea foam. She told him to wrap it around his chest and swim. It would keep him afloat. He trusted her. He swam. For 2 days, he swam. The water held him in its cold embrace, and the veil kept him afloat. His arms ached. His legs grew heavy. The salt stung his eyes until the world was a blur of gray and silver. But he kept moving. Stroke after stroke, breath after breath, he moved through the wine-dark water toward something he could not yet see. On the second evening, he heard it. A sound beneath the wind. The low murmur of water meeting stone, a river mouth. The current shifted around him, and the waves lost their open ocean weight. He felt the pull of fresh water mixing with salt. He turned toward the sound. The shoreline appeared through the mist. Not cliffs, not rocks, but a gentle slope of sand where a river emptied itself into the sea. The water there was calm. The tide was slack. He let the current carry him inward. His feet touched bottom. He stood swaying in water that reached his waist. The sand beneath his feet was fine and cool. He waded forward. Each step was slower than the last. The weight of his own body astonished him after so long in the water. He reached the shore. He fell to his knees on the wet sand. Then he lay down, pressing his face against the earth. It smelled of mud and river grass and stone. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. The stillness of solid ground after the ceaseless motion of the sea. For a long time, he simply breathed. The waves behind him whispered against the sand. The river murmured beside him. Somewhere above, birds called softly in the dusk. He unwound the veil from his chest and let the current take it back to the goddess who had saved him. He needed shelter. Even through his exhaustion, he knew this. The air was growing cool. Night was coming. He crawled up the riverbank on hands and knees, moving slowly through the twilight. And there, just above the waterline, he found it. A thicket of olive bushes, 2 of them growing so close together that their branches wove into a single canopy. The ground beneath them was dry and soft with fallen leaves. The branches above were dense enough to hold back wind and rain. He crawled beneath the olive boughs. The leaves were silver green, even in the fading light. They rustled softly as he settled among them. He gathered the fallen leaves around him, pulling them over his body the way a farmer banks embers beneath ash at the end of a long day, layer upon layer until the warmth began to build. The thyme that grew at the edges of the thicket released its scent as he pressed against the earth. The smell was sharp and clean. It reminded him of hillsides he had known, of stone walls warmed by afternoon sun, of a life that existed somewhere beyond the sea. His breathing slowed. The olive branches above him moved gently in the evening air. Through the gaps in the leaves, he could see the first stars appearing. They were the same stars he had steered by, but now they asked nothing of him. He did not need to read them or follow them. He could simply watch them, the way one watches firelight without purpose. The exhaustion came over him like a tide. Not the cold tide of the open ocean, but something warm and merciful. It started in his feet, which had not rested in days. It moved through his legs and into his chest. His arms grew heavy at his sides. His hands, which had gripped rope and timber and water, finally uncurled. The sounds of the shore settled around him, the river's low voice, the distant breathing of the sea, the small rustlings of the olive leaves above, each one catching the breeze and releasing it. These sounds braided together into something that was almost silence, almost music. The mist rose from the river and drifted through the thicket. It softened the edges of the world. The trees, the stones, the shoreline, all of it grew vague and gentle. The moonlight touched the mist and made it glow, a pale silver light that held no heat but offered something quieter than warmth. He closed his eyes. The leaf bed held him the way the sea had held him, but without the restlessness. Here, there was no current to fight, no horizon to chase. Only the steady ground beneath him and the weight of olive leaves above. Only the smell of earth and thyme and salt air drying on his skin. Sleep came to him then. Not the shallow, watchful sleep of the raft, not the guarded rest of a man at sea. This was something deeper. It was the kind of sleep that erases everything, the storm, the struggle, the long years away. All of it dissolved like smoke rising from an ember into the still night air. The stars turned overhead. The river continued its quiet conversation with the sea. The olive branches held their shelter above the sleeping man, and the darkness, soft and complete, settled over the shore like a wool blanket drawn up by familiar hands. He slept as though he had never done anything else. He slept as though sleep were the only country he had ever sought, and the night, generous and endless, gave him all the rest he needed. Breath by slow breath, he drifted deeper. The world grew still, the tide whispered, the stars kept their watch, and everything at last was quiet. The Princess and the Shipwrecked Man. In the kingdom of the Phaeacians, on the island called Scheria, there lived a princess named Nausicaa. She was the daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete. The palace stood white against the hills, surrounded by orchards of pear and apple and olive. The harbor below held dark-hulled ships. The air always carried the scent of salt and ripe fruit. Nausicaa was young, but she carried herself with the steady composure of someone older. She had her mother's practical mind and her father's easy warmth. The people of the palace loved her. The handmaidens who attended her were more companions than servants. One night, the goddess Athena visited the princess in a dream. She came in the form of a friend, a girl Nausicaa's own age. The goddess spoke softly in the darkened room, suggesting that the morning would be a fine time to go to the river. The household linens needed washing. The day would be warm. The river pools would be clear and inviting. The dream was gentle and practical, as dreams sometimes are. Nausicaa woke with the first gray light of dawn. The suggestion lingered in her mind like the scent of bread from a distant hearth. She rose and went to her father. She asked for a wagon and mules to carry the laundry to the river. The king smiled and agreed. He could see no reason to refuse. The handmaidens loaded the wagon with bundles of linen and wool. They packed a basket with food. Bread, olives, cheese wrapped in cloth, a skin of wine, simple provisions for a day by the water. The mules stepped out through the palace gates, and the wagon rattled down the stone road toward the coast. The river met the sea in a wide, sheltered valley. Pools had formed along the bank where the current slowed, and the water there ran clear over smooth stones. Tall grasses grew along the edges. Willows trailed their branches in the shallows. The morning sun came slanting through the trees and turned the water gold. They unhitched the mules and let them wander in the soft grass by the bank. Then the work began. The young women carried the linens down to the washing pools. They waded in, the water cool around their ankles. They trod the fabric against the stones in the old way, pressing and turning, pressing and turning. The wool released its dust. The linen grew white again. When the washing was done, they spread the cloth across the warm rocks and the low bushes along the shore. The linen caught the sunlight and glowed. The wool steamed faintly as it dried. The river murmured past them, carrying small leaves and bright reflections. The afternoon opened before them like a gift. With the work finished, they ate. The bread was dense and good. The olives were dark and salt-cured. The cheese was mild. They passed the wineskin and sat in the dappled shadow of the willows. The light moved on the water. A kingfisher called from somewhere downstream. After the meal, they played. They tossed a ball between them, laughing softly, their voices carrying across the water. Nausicaa stood among them, taller than most, her hair catching the late afternoon light. The ball arced through the warm air. Their bare feet left prints in the damp sand. Not far from where they played, hidden beneath a canopy of olive branches, a man slept. He had crawled there the night before, broken by the sea. His skin was rough with dried salt. His hair was matted. Leaves covered him like a second skin. He had been sleeping the deep, heavy sleep of absolute exhaustion. The voices reached him through the layers of that sleep. They came to him slowly, like light filtering through water. High, clear voices, the sound of laughter, the splash of the ball landing in the shallows. He stirred beneath his blanket of olive leaves. Odysseus woke. He lay still for a moment, listening. The sounds were unmistakable, human voices, the living world. He had not heard such sounds in a very long time. He rose slowly, stiff in every joint. He covered himself as best he could with leafy branches, for he had nothing else. Then he stepped out of the thicket. The handmaidens saw him and stepped back. He was a rough sight, salt-crusted and hollow-eyed, a stranger emerging from the wild brush. They moved away, uncertain, their sandals quiet on the grass. But Nausicaa did not move. She stood where she was, steady as a young olive tree rooted in good soil. Her eyes were calm. She looked at the stranger with neither fear nor pity, but with something closer to recognition. Here was a person in need. That was enough. The wanderer spoke to her gently. His voice was hoarse from the sea. He told her he had been adrift and that the water had carried him here. He did not ask for much, only the kindness of direction and perhaps something to wear. His words were careful and measured, the words of a man who understood how to speak to strangers. Nausicaa listened. When he had finished, she answered with the composure of someone twice her age. She told him where he was. She told him her father was the king. She called her handmaidens back and instructed them to bring food and fresh clothing. They brought him to a quiet bend in the river, away from the washing pools. They left him there with olive oil for his skin, clean linen, and a woolen cloak. He washed the salt from his body. The river water was cool and sweet after the endless brine. He dressed in the clean clothes. The linen was smooth against his skin. The cloak was warm. When he returned, the young women offered him bread and wine. He ate slowly, tasting each bite as though he had forgotten how food worked. The bread was soft. The wine was dark and warm. The olives had a richness that reminded him of home, though he did not say so. Nausicaa watched him eat with quiet satisfaction. She had done what was right, and she knew it. Hospitality was sacred in her country. A stranger at the threshold was a guest under the protection of the gods. There was no need for deliberation. There was only the simple act of offering what was needed. The afternoon light turned amber. The shadows of the willows lengthened across the water. The linen on the rocks had dried to a bright whiteness. The handmaidens began to fold the cloth and load it back onto the wagon. Their movements were unhurried, their voices soft. Nausicaa told the stranger how to find the palace. She described the road, the grove of poplars near the town, the fountain where he should wait. She told him to seek her mother, the queen, for it was the queen whose word carried the greatest weight in matters of hospitality. She spoke clearly, without hesitation, and the wanderer listened. She did not ride back with him. She went ahead with her handmaidens, the wagon rattling softly on the road. She knew that it would be better for him to arrive at the palace on his own. She was wise enough to think of these things. She was young enough not to make a show of it. The wanderer watched the wagon disappear down the road. The dust settled behind it. The river continued its quiet work beside him. He stood in his borrowed clothes and breathed the time-scented air of this unknown island. Somewhere in the orchards, a bird sang its evening song. He followed the road as she had described it. The poplars appeared just as she had said they would. The fountain was there, clear water rising from a stone basin. He knelt beside it and cupped the water in his hands. It tasted of nothing but itself, clean and cold and present. The twilight came on. The sky above the orchards deepened from gold to rose to the color of wine. The first stars appeared, faint as distant lamplight. The air cooled and carried with it the smell of wood smoke from the town, of bread baking, of hearth fires lit against the coming night. He rested by the fountain and let the stillness settle around him. The kindness of the princess stayed with him like warmth from an ember held close. In all his years of wandering, he had learned that the world was not only wind and wave, it was also this: a young woman standing firm, a clean cloak offered without conditions, bread and wine shared at a riverbank. The shadows deepened, the stars grew brighter. The smoke from the town rose in thin columns and disappeared into the darkness above. The world grew quiet. The fountain murmured its small, constant song. The mist crept in from the river and softened every edge. And in that softening, in that slow arrival of night over the island of the Phaeacians, everything began to still. The road was empty. The orchards were silent. The sea beyond the harbor breathed its long, slow breath against the shore. The wanderer closed his eyes and let the peace of the place hold him. His breathing steadied, his shoulders loosened, the day released its grip. The stars turned. The mist thickened. The darkness was kind, and the night, with all its depth and gentleness, carried him slowly, slowly into rest. The palace of the Phaeacians rose before Odysseus in the fading light, its walls gleaming with a beauty that seemed almost magical. Gardens surrounded it, where fruits hung ripe in every season, where flowers bloomed year-round, where streams of clear water ran through channels of silver and gold. It was a place of peace and plenty, protected by the gods from the troubles that plagued the wider world. He paused at the threshold, gathering his courage. The princess had told him to seek out the queen, to appeal to her wisdom and compassion. He had faced greater trials than this, he reminded himself. He had stood before kings and warriors, had argued with gods and monsters. Surely he could present himself to a queen known for her kindness. He entered the great hall, and his breath caught at the splendor that greeted him. Pillars of bronze rose to a ceiling lost in shadow. Tapestries of unimaginable beauty hung on every wall. Torches burned with light that seemed brighter than ordinary flame, casting no smoke, leaving no mark. And seated on carved thrones at the far end of the hall were the king and queen of this remarkable land. The traveler walked forward slowly, aware of the eyes upon him, the courtiers and nobles who watched this stranger approach their rulers. The air smelled of cedar smoke and honey from the evening lamps. When he reached the throne, he did as the princess had instructed. He knelt before the queen, clasped her knees in the gesture of a suppliant, and spoke from his heart. "Queen Arete," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall, "I come to you as a man blessed by the gods and cursed by them in equal measure. I have wandered for many years, seeking the home I lost, the family I love. I ask only for your help in reaching the shores of my own land. Whatever kindness you show me, the gods will repay 1,000-fold." The queen looked down at him with eyes that seemed to see more than the surface of things. She saw his weariness, his dignity, the noble bearing that no hardship could strip away. And she saw something else, something that made her lean forward with interest. "Those clothes you wear," she said quietly. "I recognize them. They were woven in this palace, by these hands. Tell me how they came to you." He explained about the princess, about how she had found him on the beach and shown him kindness, how she had given him clothing and directed him here. He spoke with honesty and gratitude, leaving nothing out, presenting himself as he was, a weary traveler, dependent on the mercy of strangers. The king, Alcinous, had been listening in silence. Now he spoke, his voice warm with welcome. "Rise, stranger. You have found your way to a house that honors the laws of hospitality above all else. Whatever help we can give, we will give gladly. But first, you must rest and eat. Tomorrow will be time enough for stories and plans. A place was made for him at the king's own table. Servants brought food and wine, the finest the palace could offer, and he ate with an appetite sharpened by days of privation." The hall buzzed with conversation around him, but no one pressed him with questions. They understood that some things could wait, that a man who had been through what he had clearly been through needed time to recover before he could speak of it. As the evening wore on and the feasting wound down, the king turned to his guest with curiosity in his eyes. "You have not told us your name, stranger," he said. "You have not told us where you come from or where you are bound. When you are ready, we would hear your story, but only when you are ready." He nodded, grateful for the consideration. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow I will tell you everything. Tonight, I can think only of rest." A chamber was prepared for him, as fine as any he had seen in the greatest palaces of Greece. The bed was soft, the linens fresh, the air scented with flowers from the magical gardens. The wanderer lay down and felt the tension of years begin to ease from his body. He was safe. He was warm. He was among people who meant him no harm. Sleep came quickly, a deep and dreamless rest that his body deeply needed. The sounds of the palace settling for the night filtered through the walls, peaceful and ordinary. The sounds of a household at ease with itself and the world. When morning came, he woke refreshed in a way he had not felt since leaving Calypso's island. He washed and dressed in fresh clothes that had been laid out for him, and made his way back to the great hall where breakfast was being served. The king and queen greeted him warmly, and he took his place at their table once more. The food was delicious, the company pleasant, and for a time he simply enjoyed the experience of being a guest in a house of peace. But eventually, the meal ended, and he knew he must fulfill his promise. The court gathered around, settling into seats and cushions, preparing to listen to the story of the stranger who had washed up on their shore. He took a deep breath and began. He told them of Troy, of the 10 years of war, of the wooden horse that had finally brought the city down. He told them of the victory celebrations, the loading of treasure, the setting sail for home with hearts full of hope. His voice was calm, measured. The voice of a man who had told this story to himself so many times that the words came without effort. But as he continued, as he spoke of the troubles that followed, his voice took on a different quality. He told of the Cicones who had met them on the beach, of the storm that had driven them off course, of the strange lands and stranger creatures they had encountered. He told of the lotus eaters whose food brought forgetting, and of the narrow escape that had left them shaken but intact. The hearth fire burned low, and the scent of wine and olive oil hung in the still air. The court listened in rapt attention, hanging on every word. These were tales beyond their experience, adventures that made their peaceful lives seem small by comparison. But there was no envy in their faces, only wonder, only sympathy for the man who had endured so much. The telling took most of the day. He spoke of giants and witches, of the land of the dead and the monsters that guarded the straits. He spoke of shipwrecks and escapes, of companions lost and chances missed. And finally, he spoke of Calypso's island, of the 7 years of gentle captivity, of the longing that had never faded, and the hope that had never died. When he finished, the hall was silent. The queen was weeping softly, moved by the depth of suffering she had heard. The king sat in thoughtful silence, his mind already turning to how he could help this remarkable man. "We will take you home," Alcinous said at last. "Our ships are the fastest in the world, guided by magic that needs no charts or stars. Tell us where Ithaca lies, and we will have you there before the moon rises tomorrow." He felt tears spring to his eyes, tears of gratitude and relief that he did not try to hide. He had traveled so far, suffered so much, and now, at last, the end was in sight. These kind strangers, these people he had never met before, were offering him the gift he had sought for 20 years. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you from the bottom of my heart." The evening was spent in celebration, in honor of the guest who would soon depart. Music filled the hall, and bards sang songs of heroes and homecomings, of love that endured and hope that never failed. The wanderer listened with a full heart, already seeing in his mind the shores of Ithaca, the faces of those he loved, the halls of his fathers waiting to receive him. That night, he slept deeply again, but this time his dreams were sweet. He dreamed of Penelope, of Telemachus, of the home that had held his place through all the years of absence. He dreamed of reunion and reconciliation, of peace after endless struggle. And when morning came, a ship was waiting in the harbor, crewed by the finest sailors of the Phaeacians, ready to carry him home. He boarded with gifts from the king piled around him, treasures that would restore his fortune and prove his identity to any who doubted. He settled into a comfortable spot, wrapped in soft blankets, and felt the ship begin to move. The harbor fell away, the palace growing small, the island receding into the distance. And the wanderer, lulled by the gentle motion of the magical ship, closed his eyes and let sleep claim him once more. When he woke, he would be home. The wandering would be over. The long journey would reach its end. The ship sailed on through waters smooth as glass, carrying the sleeping traveler toward the destination that had seemed so far away for so long. And he slept, peaceful at last, dreaming of olive groves and familiar shores, dreaming of the love that waited for him on the other side of the wine-dark sea. And so the story rests for now. The fire has settled to embers. The wind has grown still. Somewhere the sea continues its ancient song, steady as breathing, patient as sleep. Let yourself drift. Let yourself rest. The story will be here when you return.